Today we're going to take a look at the English Revolution from 1642 to 1688. This revolution is the English sense of the word, not a complete change like we see with many revolutions, but basically to mean to come into full circle, a complete revolution or 360 degrees. So it started as an armed uprising, ultimately ended with a new monarch and a new set of rules. This was an issue over where sovereignty was vested, or the ultimate authority in an area. Was sovereignty in England with a monarch or in Parliament, and what would England's religious future look like? Our question for today was which was the main cause? To help answer this question, we must look at what was created at the end of the Revolution, which was a constitutional monarch. So constitutional doesn't require a written constitution, but it does require a set of rules about government, about what government respects. In other words, it's not arbitrary. It also implies a balance of power between government and its subjects. This will be provided in Britain by the power of subjects in Parliament. And so how did England create a constitutional monarchy? Well, really, it's conflicts between the Stuart kings of England and Parliament, which we'd look at with James I and Charles I, and religious conflicts, the Anglican Church versus the Puritans. These two conflicts are really the foundation of this English Civil War. So, where do these Stuart kings come from? Well, when Queen Elizabeth died, her cousin James VI of Scotland, whose mother she had executed in 1587, became King of England. As King of Scotland, since the age of 13 months, he had overcome court factionalism and challenges from dissident Presbyterians. He was born Catholic but raised Protestant in Scotland. He was the first King of Great Britain, since he personally ruled both. He was the first monarch to have that distinction. He could be lazy, frivolous, he enjoyed hurling jelly at his courtiers, but he was also intelligent and well-read, once called, quote, the wisest fool in Christendom. He believed in the divine right of monarchy. He wrote the True Laws of Free Monarchies in 1598. In his 1609 speech, he said, quote, the state of monarchy, the supremest thing upon earth. For kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth, and sit upon the throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. Not surprisingly, relations between the king and parliament quickly deteriorated. He had inherited Queen Elizabeth's war debts, but he could not tax efficiently. His advisors further angered members of parliament, especially George Villiers, known as the Duke of Buckingham from 1592 to 1628. Buckingham convinced the king to sell peerages and titles, offices, monopolies, and other privileges to the highest bidder, which of course angered members of Parliament. Parliament itself had transformed from a debating society into a group that saw themselves as defending the rights of the English people. They impeached Lord Chancellor Francis Bacon, the scientist, on charges of bribery and became increasingly engrossed in foreign policy, most notably in James's attempt to arrange the marriage of his son Charles to Philip IV of Spain's daughter. I think at this point it's time to remind ourselves of what dynastic marriages were used for. They were used for diplomacy. A family tree will give a good example of this. So here we have the family tree of Henry VII of England and his wife Elizabeth of York. If you remember, this is the end of the War of the Roses. So let's talk about real quick how marriages were used to solidify alliances. Henry VII married his oldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Of course, Arthur dies, and so Catherine is then betrothed to Henry, who later on becomes Henry VIII. Henry VII also married his daughter, Margaret, to James IV of Scotland, who was killed by Henry VIII's army at Flodden Fields in 1513. Henry VIII married his sister, Mary, to Louis XII of France. She was queen for 3 months in the end of 1514. After her husband's death, she secretly married the Duke of Suffolk in France. Her daughter Frances gave birth to Jane Grey, which became Queen of England in July of 1533. We know that Henry's offsprings, for instance, Mary the First, which is his oldest daughter. She married Philip II of Spain, but of course she died without having any children. Elizabeth I never married, and of course Edward, who had become the first king after Henry VIII died without ever being married. And so this family tree shows us really how ultimately we get to James VI of Scotland. So he follows a line of Margaret. Her offspring was James V of Scotland. He married Mary of Guise of France. Their offspring was Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland. She gave birth to James I, which of England, who's also known as James VI of Scotland. And then from James I, we have Charles I, and then from Charles I, his sons would be Charles II and James II. So as a reminder, the whole idea behind these dynastic marriages was in fact to solidify foreign policy. So James's plans for Charles, his son, marriage was canceled in 1623, but he soon arranged for Charles to marry Henrietta Maria of France. With this, the secret promised at a later date, English Catholics, which comprised 2 to 3% of the English population, would be allowed to freely worship. This, of course, would enrage the Protestant members of Parliament. So it just seems that James could not appease any religious groups. Catholics had even tried to kill him in 1605. This is known as the Gunpowder Plot. And the idea was to kill King James I and restore a Catholic monarch to the throne. The plotters secured the lease for an underground area beneath the House of Lords, and a guy named Guy Fawkes was placed in charge of the gunpowder that they stockpiled there. Authorities searched the Westminster Palace during the early hours of November the 5th and found Fawkes guarding the explosives. Over the next few days, he was questioned and tortured, and eventually he broke. Immediately before his execution on the 31st of January, Fawkes jumped from the scaffold where he was to be hanged and broke his neck, thus avoiding the agony of the drawing and quartering that would have followed. And so Fawkes became synonymous with the Gunpowder Plot, which has been commemorated in England since the 5th of November of 1605. His effigy is often burned on a bonfire, accompanied by a firework display. This plot has become famous in the United States due to the comic book hero created in 1982, quote, V as in V for Vendetta, which was made even more popular by a movie in 2006. And so that English folk verse, which we see circa 1870, remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. So when James died in 1625, his son Charles I became king. Charles was quote-unquote worse than James. He believed in divine right, monarchy. He refused to discuss ideas with Parliament. He only called Parliament when he needed money. And so the English Parliament that James and then Charles dealt with was actually really highly organized. Since there were no other political bodies like in France, Spain, and other countries which had provisional and then local governments, Parliament represented a unified threat to any monarch's power. Landed interests dominated both houses. Towns many times elected wealthy landowners to represent them. Since the clergy no longer dominated government, since really Henry VIII, Parliament was not divided by class or even by religion. And so Charles wanted to establish absolutism in England. But these wealthy English landowners had long participated in government and expected to be consulted on these decisions. So in 1629, when Parliament forced Charles to agree to the Petition of Right, a promise not to levy taxes without Parliament's consent, Charles responded by refusing to call Parliament into session for 11 years. Charles attempted to raise money in this period by turning an emergency levy called ship money into an annual tax, but faced resistance and non-payment from the people. He further alienated powerful members of Parliament due to his religious beliefs. He followed the theologian Jacobus Arminius. Arminian theology emphasized clerical authority and the individual's ability to reject or accept salvation. This was viewed as heresy and a way for the introduction of Roman Catholicism by its Calvinist and Puritan opponents. So who are these Puritans? They did not choose the name Puritans. It was originally a term of abuse. They considered themselves the godly. They believed they represented the true Church of England. They remained a minority, maybe no more than 10% of the population, but perhaps maybe a third of the gentry. And of course, Catholics only made up 2 to 3% of the population, and the rest of the population, of course, would have been Anglican or Church of England. Puritans became hostile to the Arminians, which Charles became. Arminians had believed that an individual could achieve salvation through free will. They also, again, accepted the rituals of the Catholic Church and emphasized royal authority over the Church of England. And all of this led to disagreements with these powerful Puritan members. So Charles irritated Puritans by imposing increasingly elaborate ceremonies on the Church of England, which were similar to the Catholic rites. With Charles' support, Archbishop Laud tried to apply these same policies to Scotland, causing the Presbyterian Scots to invade the north of England in 1640. This forced Charles to summon Parliament in order to levy new taxes needed to support the war against the Scots. The short parliament, he dissolved this group after only a few days because they quickly became hostile to him. This, of course, turned political division into a total constitutional crisis. So he called for new elections. The problem is, the new elections, the same men were elected, which was not a good sign for Charles. This became known as the Long Parliament, since it officially sat for 20 years. During the summer of 1640, ordinary people began attacking Anglican churches, lashing out at Charles's rule. And so this really is a precursor of the English Civil War. So with the English army losing against the Scots, the Irish then rose up against the Protestant landowners, killing many of them. So in 1641, Parliament passed what was known as a Grand Remonstrance, which denounced the king's flaunting of English law. And it also called for religious and government reforms. Therefore, in January 1642, Charles led several hundred soldiers into Parliament to arrest the leaders of this rebellious factions. Since they were forewarned, none were arrested, and he further angered the general population. So Charles recruited an army from the northwestern part of England known as the Cavaliers. They believed they were fighting the good fight for God and for King. Their opponents became known as the Roundheads because of the short bowl-shaped haircuts that many wore. There's actually very little fighting in this civil war, but it was really a war of words. At least 2,000 pamphlets were published in 1642, averaging about 6 a day. Troop movements, forced conscription, and volunteering did affect the general population, but most counties tried to stay neutral. Despite this, about 10% of the population was displaced during the war. So we can see there that the entire war only really had 4 main battles. In the Battle of Edge Hill, Charles will win an expensive victory. A number of his important military leaders were killed or injured during the battle. This battle was also watched by one Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was a member of Parliament, landed gentry. He had converted to Puritanism later in life and was very much a zealot. Cromwell watched this battle, and after, therefore, he raised his own army, known as a New Model Army. So, enforcing rigid discipline and religious zeal, he became the most successful of the parliamentary leaders. Parliament asked Scotland for an alliance, which they received, and then Charles, of course, sought an alliance with the Irish. In 1644, the Scots entered England and marched on the Cavalier army at York. The Royalists were badly defeated at Marston Moor and lost their hold on the northern areas. By 1645, at Naseby, the king was finally defeated, and so in 1646, Charles I will surrender to the Scots. And at this point, England really has no king. A realm with no king, who has the power? And theoretically, power now rests with Parliament. But even Parliament had problems working with itself. On December 6, 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride and his soldiers stood outside the entrance of St. Stephen's Chapel and, as the Commons convened that morning, arrested 45 members and excluded a further 186 whom the army thought were unlikely to support its goal of punishing the king. So what we have here is really a military coup. So after this coup, a further 86 members left in protest, left what was called a rump of barely 200 members. Among these, a determined clique unilaterally forced through an, quote, act on the 6th of January, 1649, establishing a court to try Charles I for high treason. This, by the way, was not popular throughout the country, but they tried him anyway. They found him guilty, and he was executed. And so the office of the king and the House of Lords were now abolished. Interestingly, Charles I's popularity soared after his death, which didn't help him, but did help his legacy a little bit. So from 1653 to 1659 is known as the Protectorate, where Oliver Cromwell took control of Parliament, the House of Commons. 140 Puritan leaders were appointed. This was known as a bare-bones Parliament. By 1653, Cromwell himself abolished the bare-bones Parliament and named himself Lord Protector. We'll have in England is this military dictatorship. And so three groups really emerged during this time. You have your Presbyterians, who were associated with the Church of England and John Calvin's beliefs. You have your Independents, who rejected a compulsory church. You had your Radical Puritans. From that group, you have your Fifth Monarchy. They were waiting for the second coming of Christ. You had your Levelers. They believed in universal male suffrage, guarantees of popular sovereignty for all people. And then you have your Diggers. These were agrarian residents against private property. Food prices had reached record high in the 1640s, and they wanted the prices to come back down so they can make a living. Gotten rid of the king now, they expect things to get better, but instead there's even more discontent as people are fighting, arguing with one another. Cromwell's England was divided into 12 military districts. The instrument of government gave religious freedom to all, except, of course, Catholics. They crushed rebellions in Ireland. Oliver Cromwell enforced navigation acts where English goods had to be carried on English ships. This, of course, led to the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Interestingly, Cromwell's government welcomed Jewish people. Cromwell himself was very tolerant, although not to Catholics. The state censored the press, forbade sporting events and gambling. The Sabbath was a day of reflection and prayer, not leisure time. They closed theaters. And Christmas, although not technically canceled, was severely limited. Those caught celebrating any holy feast, including Christmas, were punished with fines. And these holy days would fall on any day of the week. So if you were caught celebrating these on any day except on a Sabbath, you would be fined. This wasn't very successful. A man by the name of John Taylor published this portrait of how traditions were still being kept. When Old Christmas came back in 1660, Taylor had already died, but I'm sure he would have been happy to celebrate Christmas again. And Cromwell, well, he died in 1658. His son Richard could not successfully follow his father, so the Stuarts were brought back. And this is known as a restoration. So since Charles I was dead and a corpse could not make for a proactive monarch, his son was invited to take the crown. He had been living in various countries with a reward on his head of the successful capture of him. So in 1672, Charles issued the Royal Declaration of Indulgence, in which purported to suspend all penal laws against Catholics and other religious dissenters. In the same year, he openly supported Catholic France and started what was known as the Third Anglo War. This led to the Test Act of 1673. Parliament opposed the Declaration of Indulgence on constitutional grounds by claiming that the king had no right to arbitrarily suspend laws passed by Parliament. So Charles withdrew the declaration and also agreed to the Test Act, which not only required public officials to receive the sacrament under the forms prescribed by the Church of England. And so, although better times were under Charles II, they still had this conflict between the government and religion, specifically with the Catholic religion. Charles had no surviving children, so his brother James II succeeded him. James appointed Catholics to high positions, contrary to the Test Act. He also suspended the law at will, and England feared absolutism. And then, of course, a couple of things happened. James declared religious freedom for all. This religious toleration was not welcomed by many people, fearing a papist plot. And then two events signaled what will become the revolution itself. 7 bishops were arrested for not complying with the Declaration of Indulgence, and James's second wife produced a male heir. James's second wife was actually Catholic. His first wife had been Protestant, but she died. And so the Tories and Whigs in Parliament offered the throne to James's Protestant daughter, Mary, and William III of Orange, who was also his nephew, to, quote, save the Protestant religion. And so there you can see Charles I, Charles II, and Mary, William of Orange, Mary, and then James had 2 daughters, Mary and Anne, both from his first wife, and they were both raised Protestant and married Protestant princes. James' second wife was Catholic, and then his son will be known as James III or James the Pretender. So James knows his history really well. So when these things happened, he actually fled the country to go raise an army. William's army landed in 1688 and was welcomed by Parliament. And this is known as a glorious or bloodless revolution because it had very little bloodshed and was the end of divine right monarchy in England. William and Mary accepted the throne, but recognized the supremacy of Parliament. The rights of the people were listed in what's known as the Bill of Rights. And so these Bill of Rights were not rights guaranteed to people. It was a limitation on the government itself, on the monarch itself. So laws were made by Parliament, could not be suspended by the Crown. Parliament had to be called at least every 3 years. The Crown could not interfere with Parliament. Judges would be independent, no standing army in peacetime. The English monarch must be Protestant, which is still true today. Freedom of worship to Protestant dissenters. Again, these differ from the U.S. Bill of Rights, which guarantee individual rights from government, versus this is actually limitations on government. And so on February 13th, 1688, the Declaration of Rights was accepted and proclaimed by William and Mary. So they had these three parts. They had to indict James and his transgressions. They had the Declaration of Rights of Citizens. And William III and Mary II were declared King and Queen of England, where William would exercise all power during his lifetime. Because they had no children, once they died, the crown would go to Queen Anne, which was James's second daughter. This was done through the Act of Settlement in 1701. If Queen Anne outlived all of her children, then it would be offered to the Hanoverian family of Hanover, Germany. And that's exactly what happened. In 1714, Queen Anne died, and George I became the King of England. So until 2011, it would disqualify an English monarch to marry a Catholic. So England changed the law in 2011, but retained that a Catholic could not become the monarch, as that would conflict with their role as the head of the Church of England. So during this time, John Locke, a philosopher, wrote an instrumental work called Two Treatises of Government. This was written during the Revolution and published afterwards, where he argued that people set up governments to protect life, liberty, and property. If government oversteps the bounds, then it said people have a natural right to revolt against that government. These are things that become the foundations for America, the American colonies declaring their freedom from England in 1776. So to recap, major concepts to know when dealing with the English Civil War and the English Revolution. You've got your Charles I, the short parliament, long parliament, the Civil War, Cavaliers and Roundheads. You have Oliver Cromwell, the New Model Army, Puritan Commonwealth, the Rump Parliament, the Protectorate, this military dictatorship. You have the Restoration, where the Stuarts were brought back. You have Charles II, and then James II. And then again, our big question. What was the main cause of the Civil War? Was it political sovereignty, who had ultimate authority, or was it religious divisions within England?